We're back here with Vincent Stanley from Patagonia, and he is going to share with us some insights on successful innovation and transformation inside Patagonia, and then also maybe some current updates on where Patagonia is headed in terms of its goals. So Vincent, thank you for being back with us, and
thanks.
Just share.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think that I've been with the company since it started. And I think that there have been some really important changes in the past 15 years that affect the way we operate and what we're capable of, and also have affected the direction for our future. If 15 years ago, if you'd asked me how Patagonia operated, I would have said, well, we have the environmental grants organization, the tree huggers, who are also looking at our internal practices. We have the salespeople who are kind of the go-getters who are trying to increase their market share and make the most innovative product possible. And then you also had at the other end of the table some of the finance or the accounting types who are trying to prevent the rest of us from running away with all the money. So none of these groups ever won. All of these groups were in tremendous tension with each other, the tree huggers, the go-getters, and the bean counters. But nobody ever won, and the company kind of advanced by capillary action because each of these groups became stronger in the way they operated and more knowledgeable. What I'd say has happened now that's very different is I see an alignment, not only from the ownership through the top management to the middle management, but I see an alignment across the company horizontally. So that if I'm a product manager now, if I'm the product manager for Alpine, I know I still need to hit my margins. I still need to develop the most innovative product. But I also know that I need to make more of those products in fair trade certified labor factories, and that I need to get rid of the durable water repellent that persists in the environment that I haven't yet found a solution to do. And I own this problem. This is not something I'm expecting the environmental department or the finance people to come and slap my hand. This is something I own and my team owns. So that's critical. The other thing I think that's made a big difference is we've simplified our mission statement, which for 27 years was build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. Very strong mission statement and very useful for all of the people working in the company. We understood those three clauses and that they were a part of our work. But last December, we simplified it to we're in business to save our home planet. And when Emo started talking about that, I was skeptical. He was promoting this internally. And I thought, well, that sounds a little like greenwashing to me. But when we adopted it, what I noticed instantly is that every group in the company started to look at its own work in light of that mission statement and ask themselves, is what we're doing in line with this mission that we're in business to save our home planet? The initiatives we undertake now, we still discover things and then discover things that are done in our name or that we're doing that we want to make changes, we want to change. But increasingly, we're looking long-term at 2025, 2030, 2035, and looking at the practices that will take 5 to 10 to 15 years to change. We're looking at our company through the lens of the Johan Rockström resilience guidelines of what the planet can stand. We have committed to being carbon neutral by 2025 and getting out of fossil fuels as a feedstock for nylon and polyester and seeking alternative sources. And we're committed when we're talking about carbon neutrality, we're not just talking about our own operations, which would be pretty simple to do. We're also talking about partnering with factories and textile mills to do that. So we've become much more ambitious, I think. And I think that these ambitions are realizable now, partly because of the strong alignment within the company.
Wonderful. And it took you some time to get there, right? It was sort of a collective realization and, of course, an adaptation in many ways. And one could potentially see the Business Roundtable statement as one of those ambitious statements, even though it's not even close to far enough or close to where Patagonia is aiming to be. And it probably starts with a declaration at some point. Would you be able to share some of the insights that you have gained in terms of transforming, innovating internally at the various levels with the students?
Yeah. I will. Just a quick comment on a direction for the Business Roundtable folks. I think that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are a really key tool for business to use. You know, these were agreed upon by 183 different countries. They took a long time to adapt. They're time sensitive to 2030. And I think if you combine the Sustainable Development Goals with the methodology that B-Lab uses to evaluate impact assessment, I think that that's a good direction for those folks. For Patagonia specifically, I think what's happened now is that our business model is actually, our innovation is actually based on constraint. Our designers, if I'm an ordinary fashion designer, I can go to the fashion library at FIT in New York and choose from hundreds, if not thousands, of fabric samples in their library. And I can use any one of them in the development of my line. If I'm a designer at Patagonia, I'm really limited to maybe 150 to 400 fabrics because I want to know, I have to vet the chemicals used in the textiles, the labor standards used in the mills, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens is that because of those constraints, I understand those fabrics really well. I have a deep knowledge of them and I know how to combine them. I know how to use them in ways for which they're intended. It is not a transactional business. It's a business that really requires deep knowledge of everything that we're engaged in, but also takes advantage of that in order to innovate. And I think that that's something that companies really have to look at. I hear and I read everywhere the statement that there should be a balance between profit and purpose. And when I read that, I go a little crazy because I think that you are not going to, in the long run, pursue purpose if you make it a balance with profit. And I think that profit, the entire business model, has to be congruent with your purpose for the business to work.
And when you share a little bit about the processes that you said you started internally to innovate, even without much money, you said that wasn't really the key. How would you describe how they have worked, and what could other companies learn from you, and how to go about it?
I can give you another. I'm thinking I'm thinking less about product development than the kinds of initiatives that change behavior in companies. So one project that we worked on 12 years ago in 2007 was the development of Footprint Chronicles. And we essentially did that without a budget and without a staff. Everybody was volunteer. And everybody was so committed to this project that we really made it work. And of course, then eventually we got funding and it was successful. Another parallel to this in a larger company is in the fall of 2017, Danone, the big French yogurt and water company, baby food company, bought the largest U.S. wholesale organic dairy wholesaler, White Wave. And it was a $6 billion corporation. And they made the commitment to turn that into a B Corp, and they gave it 3 years, understanding that no B Corp at the time was larger than $1 billion. So you have a brand new acquisition, you're operating, you've made a commitment to change the way business is done in a major way in 3 years. And what happened is the employees, it became a B Corp in 1 year. And Lorna Davis, the woman who was involved, she was actually embedded by the CEO of Danone into B Lab to really work collaboratively to figure out how B Lab could assess the impact of a company that large. She attributes the speed with which Danone North America became a B Corp to the commitment of the millennial employees who really wanted to make it happen and did. So there were like 100 people working to gather the data and do the work necessary to become a B Corp. So that's a second example. I think values are undervalued in business because they are such a strong human motivator, and it's difficult to quantify human engagement. But I've seen time and again, if you want to change practices, that's absolutely essential, that engagement.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So this is sort of a systemic change example also. Let's say an organizational level change, yeah, where a framework like the B Lab framework can help and energize, it seems, a number of employees at a core value level. You at Patagonia, you've spoken about product and service innovation as well. Would you be able to share a little bit? Because I think it's well known that it started out as sort of a climbing gear organization, a company.
Yeah.
and then there were a couple of shifts, right?
Yeah. I think it was critical that we started as a climbing equipment company, partly because we had an almost involuntary devotion to quality. Because in climbing gear, you're not making good, better, best. You're really, your customers are trusting their lives to the quality of your gear. So that made a difference. And early on, we made a big discovery in the early 1970s that the pitons we used, the iron spikes that climbers use for protection, were actually damaging the rock. And so we were faced with a moral decision quite early. Do we continue to sell these pitons without developing an alternative that won't harm the rock? And to go through the process of finding out if there was an alternative. And there was, and we did that. And I think that we've approached, as I mentioned, I think for many years, this was kind of a model for change at Patagonia. We would just discover something that we were doing, and we would stop it, and we learned how to do that. I think now it is different. As I mentioned, we have these broad goals for the clothing company, but we also got into the food business, and the food business is really an interesting space because agriculture poses huge threats to the environment, the way industrial agriculture is practiced, but also offers huge potential. Because if you switch to regenerative agriculture, if you get rid of monocultural practices that we have, if you plant rotationally, if you plant companion crops together, for instance, turmeric with cotton, if you reduce tilling And if you use deep-rooted plants, you can actually create topsoil faster than nature can. When you create topsoil when you create rich topsoil, you reduce the need for water, you reduce the need for even organic fertilizers. And when you reduce the use of chemicals, you reduce the risk to our water supply, the pollution of our water supplies. There are excellent controls in place for industrial waste in the developed world, but almost no controls over agricultural pollution into rivers and waterways. So I'll give you an example, the way this changes the way we approach business. We started this little food company a few years ago, and we started off with products like organic fruit bars. But the more we got engaged in the business, the more we saw problems in agriculture that we could actually solve by developing a product. I'll give you an example. Wes Jackson is this wonderful old guy who's 80, in his early 80s now, whose life project for 50 years has been to save and restore the Great Plains. And the Great Plains once had the richest topsoil in the world. And over 25 years ago, he developed a perennial wheatgrass called Kernza, with roots that go 17 feet deep into the ground. Well, when you create a plant with roots that deep, those roots break up the soil. They create a perfect environment for the microbes and fungi that create new soil. It's an amazing plant. He told us about this. We got very excited, and we said, oh, great, where can we buy some? He said, you can't buy it. He says, I've been trying for 20 years to get farmers to plant it, and they won't do it. I said, why? He said, well, they can't sell it to anybody. They don't have a market. That's what they tell me. So what we did is we contracted with a brewer in Portland to create a beer that used Kernza as part of the content label. And so for the first time, we got 200 acres of Kernza grown on an experimental farm in Minnesota. And a major food company looked at this, and they understood, because the other thing, when you bring soil back to health, you create this extraordinary capacity to draw carbon deep into the ground. And so they looked at this and said, oh, we could, if we put 3% of this into our cereal, we could plant 20,000 hectares of Kernza. So I think that this, when I spoke earlier about the potential for business to do good things in a good way, I think this is the unique capacity of business, which is to look at a problem, a social or an environmental problem, and solve it through a product, which is creating products and services, which is self-sustaining. It doesn't require an increase in taxes. It doesn't require foundation grants. And that is, I think that is the most useful role for businesses as a social sector for the next decades to come.
Wonderful and so inspiring. And I feel like the world needs to know about this. Just like what I'm sensing is here, there's a deep problem-solving oriented approach. And it sort of strikes me as, okay, here's a company that starts out with climbing gear, also focused on an issue that, okay, I can't find the kind of climbing gear that I want. And so unfortunately, I have to make it. Okay, so fortunately, I make it and I make it happen and it works. And they're really like there's non-engineers in the background in a way that just try to figure out what and how can I do this. I'm not clear on how many agronomic experts you have at Patagonia at the time, at least, that you have this kind of insight about, okay, well, let's create a beer. How did this all develop? Because I think this is really critical. It's like understanding this is something that is sort of almost like at a meta level of what the company is operating in or what the strategies are, but sort of this creative space. And I think one of your titles is a director of corporate philosophy of some sort. In what way does this mesh? Because this is rather untypical.
Well, I don't think I've ever had this question posed. And I want to make make sure I understand it correctly, but I actually think it's been critical to us that we've always worked with partners. So even when we were when Ivo, you mentioned that he got into the climbing business. He did this as a teenager because he couldn't find the gear he wanted for the new kinds of climbs that his friends were doing. He and his friends were doing in Yosemite. He basically got a book out of the Burbank Library on how to blacksmith, and set up in his parents' backyard, borrowed some money from them to buy a used forge. But he also worked very early on with this genius machinist in Burbank, who had also done a lot of special work for Lockheed whenever they need some kind of innovative project done. I mentioned the problems that we had, that we created when we divorced ourselves from the global supply chain, and bought cotton from farmers. And one of the problems we had early on is the spinners wouldn't talk to us. And they said, we hate organic cotton, it gums up our machines. But we solved that problem by finding someone who looked at this as a problem, as a challenge, and said, oh, okay, all I have to do is to cool down the room, and then I won't have that problem. And we asked him later, we said, why did you do this? Why didn't you just send us away like everybody else? He says, well, call me a closet environmentalist. So I think that what we have done all along the way is to find people of shared value and shared purpose who kind of dug what we were doing and wanted to engage with us to get the work done. But we certainly never had enough employees with enough expertise to pursue the kinds of goals that we wanted to do without help. When we wanted to get life cycle analyses of everything we make, we basically went to the entire clothing industry and created an organization that is capable of doing that, whose members sell 50% of the footwear and clothing in the world, Sustainable Apparel Coalition, so that they could develop the analytics, because we knew that we couldn't do this on our own. So that's critical. And it's going to be more critical. There's going to be more opportunities and needs, I think, for government and civil society and business to work together to solve problems. Because the problem is not whether business is successful, the problem is whether communities and bioregions can thrive. And business is just a part of that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And students, I think this matches well with Andrew Winston's sort of admonition to partner, radical partnership, and being open to this collaboration. We talked about this as collaborative advantage. When you, as I think Patagonia, you basically experience this enormous power of collaboration when you tap into these shared human values and saying, you know what, closeted environmentalists, well, maybe I won't say it, but this is what gave rise to this creative energy. And I think this is what you can see and tap into much more forcefully, intentionally. And I would encourage you students to look at that. Where and how is the organization that you're representing right now for this exercise tapping into that? Is there a larger kind of process, a type of playground for these conversations, for this to happen? And what is the authenticity of that? And in what way can people actually, or want people to work with you to solve these problems? Another piece that I just find fascinating when I hear it and think about is, okay, there is clothing, the outdoor protection in some way, and now you're moving towards the inner, the health protection, right, through products. And if I recall correctly, you're almost like Patagonia is doing a shift towards a new industry from a perspective. This is part of the healing or the restoring of the planet, of the home, right? Yeah.
I'd say that the example I gave you of the beer, that this is the North Star for us now, the development of products that actually do, that every product we make in provisions solves some kind of problem.
Wonderful. I mean, this is so fantastically aligned with the message of this course, this whole program. And Susan, I hope that you can get it. Patagonia is seen as one of the few examples out there, and I think you mentioned it yourself. So you hear it directly. In what way, what we're learning, what you're tasked with, is probably helpful to shifting a number of the organizations that you might be working with. Because whether it is clothing, whether it is food, all of those products and services are something that we actually probably need. And if we don't need them fundamentally, we shouldn't produce them. We should get out of them. And there's probably a lot of product development that needs to happen to create the kind of planet that we can sustain, that we can live on and pass on to the future. So Vincent, thank you so much for doing this, for taking the time.
Thanks.